Hey guys! In this video I want to show you a few modules that you can use for adding motion and movement to your sounds and building more organic and natural patches. Let's start! Okay, so I think that the most important aspect that we should keep in mind is that imperfection is not necessarily a thing we have to avoid. And actually, when we think about it, producing sounds that are organic and natural often involves introducing mistakes into the patch and making sure that things will not always sit together and be flawless. Another thing to keep in mind is that in most cases the changes we will make to the sounds are very subtle and fine, so I really recommend putting your headphones on so you can hear the different outcomes. Now, there are a few modules I want to show you today that can help us achieve imperfection. They are very easy to use and all of them are available for free. And let's start with Detune from Bog Audio, this one here. This module will take pitch information, volt per octave, and will detune it slightly up and down. So we have the volt per octave input and two outputs, positive and negative. We also have a through output, so we can chain a few of them together. And with the sense knob, we can determine by how many cents the pitch will be detuned. So this is a perfect example for adding imperfection to a patch, for adding movement by detuning the pitch. Now of course we can also just detune the oscillators themselves, but with this module it's much easier, and we can also modulate the sense amount with the CV input. So let's start adding some voices, and let's use two Voldemar oscillators from Lindenberg Research. I will just duplicate this one. Let's take them 2 octaves down, something like this. Now let's mix a bit of square waves or pulse waves, just a bit, and sine waves, maybe a bit more, so we can mix a few different waveforms together and get them out of the mix output. Now let's use constants. From ML, this module will output constant voltage, in this case in steps of semitones. And let's use also the fundamental sequential switch. This will be our sort of sequencer. Now we will use a two-step sequence, so just change it here with the switch. The first one will be positive 12 semitones and the second one will be positive 7 semitones. Now I'm using the 12 semitones output because I want it also to be affected by the detune module. Now we can use a divided clock to run the sequential switch, every clock divided by 4, so this will go to the clock input of the sequential switch. And I will also want to create a sort of a glide between the notes, so let's use slew, which is a slew limiter also from Bog Audio. Now we can send the signal from the sequential switch to slew, the slew limiter, and then to detune, to the volt per octave input of detune. And from there to both oscillators, let me just make the opacity here high, to both oscillators, one the positive output and one the negative output. And let's set a nice rise and fall times to the slew limiter. This will create a sort of glide or portamento between the notes. And let's see how it sounds like before we start introducing detune. So I will take the mix outputs from both oscillators to the mixer. So this is what we got. This is the sort of a sequence we got. And now let's start introducing some detune. Again, put your headphones on. Let's have a listen. Somewhere here it's nice, but we can go all the way up and create something crazier. Okay, but somewhere here it's nice, and you can hear how all of a sudden we have a much bigger sound and it's moving rather than staying static. Now another thing we can do, since we are using square waves, we can modulate their pulse width and add even more movement to the sound. So let's use the 8FO. Again, Boog Audio, this LFO will send 8 different phases of the same wave, of the same sine wave. So we have actually 8 different LFOs. Let's push the offset all the way up so we get a unipolar signal, and turn it to slow mode, turn the frequency a bit down. And let's modulate the pulse width of both oscillators. It's in this section here. Open the attenuator a bit. Let's choose a different phase. And let's have a listen. Without pulse width. And with. So we already have some motion going on, and again it's a small change, but at the end of the day it's all about the nuances. And now let's add another voice. Let me just turn this down for a second. So let's add another voice, and for this I will use the FM operator, again Boog Audio, and let's use the phrase sequencer from Impromptu Modular. Now let's program a simple 5-note sequence, so I'll change the length of the sequence to 5 notes. And let's see, let's start from B flat, then going to G, F, E flat, and C. And also here, creating a 5-note sequence instead of say 4 notes or 8 notes, we also add a sort of an imperfection, and by this create also an organic feel. So for adding motion to this voice, I will use Slop from Triggerfish. It looks like this. And there are actually 2 slop modules, so this one is for a single voice, but there is another one for 4 voices. I will use the single voice version, so let's delete this one here. And this module is actually very interesting. It also receives pitch information, but it adds drift to the notes, so the notes drift in and out of tune. And we can also add hum to the signal, which is another kind of modulation to the pitch signal. It's replicating behavior from the hardware world, where the power supply bleeds into the system. It's a really nice effect. And we can also reduce the tracking accuracy, so the notes won't stay in tune across the different octaves, again adding imperfection to the sound, and by that adding motion. So let's send the phrase sequencer through slop to the oscillator, to the volt per octave input of the oscillator. Let's change the settings a bit more drift and a bit more hum, a bit less accuracy, tracking accuracy. Let's also modulate already the feedback amount of the oscillator with the LFO. Let's choose a different phase and turn the attenuator a bit up, somewhere here. Now we can send another divided clock, every clock divided by 8, to run the sequencer, to the clock input of the sequencer, and let's turn the run function on. And now let's hear how this sounds like. Let's connect it to the mixer. So you can hear how it drifts in and out of tune, becoming very organic and full of motion. Okay, now let's add another module that we can use. Let's use the booty shifter from Squinky Labs. I will turn this down again. Now this module is a bit different than what we've seen until now. In this case we will send the actual sound through it and shift its frequency up and down. We have the shift amount knob with a few range options. we have 5 Hz, 50 Hz, 500 Hz, and 5 kHz. And then we have exponential. In exponential mode, the modulation will start all the way to the left with 2 Hz, and all the way to the right, it goes up to 2 kHz. Now it will also follow 1 volt per octave. Then we have 2 outputs, up and down, and from them we will get respectively the shifted signals. So let's add some voices. Let's go down here. Let me turn the sound again so we can still listen to it a bit. And let's add some voices. I will use tangents in this case from Vult. And let's crank up the resonance until it self-oscillates. Now let's tune this. Let's use Hotuna from Nischi to tune this. I will tune this to the note C, C5. With a cutoff knob, we can tune it now. Very nice, we will use this later also, so let's leave it here. Now let's send it through the booty shifter to the mixer. And now the up output and the down output to the mixer. Very nice. And now you can hear that when I start shifting the signal, let's start. Let's solo this for a second so you can hear it better. You get this beating effect from the frequencies interrupting each other, cancelling and amplifying one another. And this adds lots of movement. So let's turn those voices back up. And let's modulate the shift amount with our LFO, but I want to just slightly modulate it. So we will use also the dual attenuverter from Befaco. So let's take another output from our LFO to the attenuverter, to the CV input of the booty shifter, and open the attenuverter just a bit. Very nice. So now we get a nice moving organic sound. Let's add another tangents. Again, self-oscillates. And this time let's tune it to the note E. Or E flat actually, which is here D sharp, but in our case it's E flat. I will still use it later. Now let's send it again through another booty shifter, again to the mixer. And let's again modulate its shift amount, again through the dual attenuverter. So let's choose a different phase. Very nice. Now another thing we can do, if we're already using tangents, we can also modulate its resonance for creating another sort of detuning effect. So let's add another tangents, and this time I will tune it to the note G. Very nice. Now we don't need Hotuna anymore. And now let's lower the resonance just to the point where it starts to self-oscillate. So I will connect this to the mixer. And let's turn the resonance down. Here, somewhere here. Very nice. Now let's use the LFO to modulate the resonance. And you can hear that the note is not a perfect G, it's a bit detuned. Again, something that adds lots of movement. Very nice. So those were a few modules to help us create and add imperfection in the tuning of the different sounds, and by that add movement and motion and make the patch a bit more organic, to my taste at least. Let's have a look now at a couple of more modules, but this time we will use them to morph and slowly change between different sounds. Okay, so another great way for adding motion to your sounds is to morph between slightly different sources and add more colors to a somewhat static sound. And the first module I want to show you is Morph from MSM. This one here, of course, we will change this to the night mode. With this module, we can morph and scan through up to 8 different sources. So let's use the Palm Loop oscillator from 21 kHz and also use the grid sequencer from JW. Now, the Palm Loop oscillator has 5 different waveforms, and the lower row is also tuned 1 octave lower than the upper one. So let's send all of them to morph. This is the sine wave or the sawtooth wave, then a sine wave, square wave, triangle wave, and another sine wave 1 octave lower. And with this knob here, we can set the amount of inputs we want to scan through. So let's set it to 5. You can see the lights are turning on. And let's also set a nice sequence on the grid sequencer, something maybe like this maybe. Turn the range maybe a bit down. Now let's run it with a multiplied clock. I have a clock multiplied by 4. And send its output to the volt per octave input of the Palm Loop oscillator. And let's see how this sounds like. So I will connect a morph to the mixer. And now let's start morphing. Very nice. Now we can also modulate the morph function. So let's use the tri or 3LFO from AS. And let's see. Let's turn the frequency a bit down and take a sine wave to the CV input of morph. Now I also want this sound will be a bit more percussive, so let's use a VCA. This one is from the fundamental modules, and an ADSR, again Boog Audio. And let's change in the right click menu of the grid sequencer, we can change the mode to retrigger mode. So we will have longer gates for our ADSR module. Let's set a nice snappy envelope, something like this maybe. Let's release. Very nice. Now let's send the gate output from the sequencer to the gate input of the ADSR. And let's send morph first to the VCA and then to the mixer, and then modulate the VCA with our envelope. Yeah, something like this. Very nice. Okay. Now let's have a look at another module we can use for morphing between different sounds, and this one is Pulsars from the Geodesics collection. Again, turn it to the dark matter edition. Now I have to admit, this module can be a bit intimidating at start, but it's actually very easy to use and it's quite unique. So first of all, let's create some different sounds. I will use the even VCO from Befaco. Let's lower its octave a bit, and let's also use a mult, this one here, and the scope, so we can see what's going on. And let's start adding some wave shapers for sculpting different sounds. Let's start with shaper from Squinky Labs. It's this one here. Now we will use a sine wave, so let's take it to the mult, once to the scope. This will be our original waveform, and once to shaper, and then to the scope, so we can see how it looks like. And let's change the sound a bit. I will choose maybe full wave rectifier. Let's turn the gain and offset a bit up. Now let's use the Debriatus from Vult. And again, send the sine wave once to the Debriatus and then to the scope. And let's see, let's fold it a bit. Very nice, and saturate it also. Okay. And let's also use West Coast. Again, Lindenberg research, again, sine wave to West Coast and then to the scope so we can see how it looks like. And let's choose overdrive, raise the gain a bit, the bias or the offset, something like this. Okay, so now let's get rid of the scope and we can send all three of them to the upper pulsar. And let's actually use also the even waveform and a pulse wave or square wave and also a sawtooth wave. And again, let's modulate the pulse width, something that can add lots of movement. So again, I will use my LFO. Now for driving pulsars, we will use again the LFO. So let's take a sine wave to the MC squared input. From here we will drive pulsars. We just have to make sure we're in the correct settings, because this LFO, let's take the frequency a bit down, this LFO is unipolar, so we have to set these pulsars or this pulsar to unipolar. So now you can see it starts morphing between the different sounds, but let's turn on also supernova mode so it will morph in a random fashion. If you want to know more about pulsars, there will be a link in the description to a video I made about it. And now let's use also a filter. Again, I will use tangents from Vult and send the upper pulsar, this output, to the low pass input of the filter. Let's turn the resonance a bit up and send this to the mixer. Let's see how this sounds like. Turn the frequency of the LFO a bit more up. Very nice. So you can hear how pulsars morphs and scans between the different sounds, and we get a sound full of motion. Now let's also modulate the cutoff point of the filter. So again, let's use the LFO. Turn this down a bit. Open the attenuator. This maybe. Very nice. Now we can also use the lower pulsar to send one source to a few destinations. So let's duplicate the grid sequencer. I will put it here down. And let's change the sequence slightly. Let's make it maybe something like this maybe. Okay, and let's use the even 3. Again, Squinky Labs, I have it here. Now this module is actually 3 even VCOs in one module and very CPU efficient. So let's set them all to square waves or pulse waves. And let's tune them also differently. So let's take the first one 2 octaves down. The second one also, but I will raise it a perfect 5th. Very nice. And let's take the third one 1 octave down. Now let's send the signal from the grid sequencer to the first volt per octave input, and this will send this signal to all 3 oscillators. Now let's use another multiplied clock to run this sequencer, every clock multiplied by 2. So let's run the second grid sequencer, and let's add another tangents. Now let's use the mixed signal from the even 3 and send it to the low pass input of tangents and then to the mixer. Very nice. So now we can start mixing the different oscillators. So let's raise the volume. This will be oscillator number 1. A bit more resonance. Maybe change this here a bit. Yeah. Okay, now let's use another LFO here and send it to the lower pulsar. We have one input and a few outputs, so let's use again a sine wave. Turn the frequency a bit down. And now from there, let's go to the 3 PWM inputs of the oscillator. So I'll take 1, 2 and 3. Very nice. Now let's change the settings of the lower pulsar again to unipolar, because this input, this MC² input will run both when nothing is connected to the second MC² input. So again we need a unipolar setting. And let's again activate the supernova mode, so it will morph randomly between the different signals. And let's start it reducing some pulse width modulation. So let's see, let's turn the pulse width a bit to the left of all 3 of them. See what it sounds like, and let's open the attenuator. Okay, now another thing I like doing that can add some motion in the sound or to the sound is to send the pitch information I'm using also to the filter's cutoff point CV input, which means that higher notes will pass more through the filter, but the lower notes will stay filtered. And the idea behind this is that the sequencer will output more voltage for creating higher notes, and more voltage means more modulation amount. Now in this case I will also want to use an LFO to modulate the filter, so let's use UMix from Bog Audio. Now this module we can use for mixing the CV coming out from the grid sequencer and the LFO. So let's see, let's send the grid sequencer to UMix and also another LFO. Very nice. Now let's right click on UMix and set it to average. This will make sure that the signal will not go too high, too hot. And now we can use this here to modulate the filter's cutoff point. So let's do this. Very nice, so you can hear how much motion and movement we have in this patch. And that was it, guys. Of course there are many more ways for adding motion and movement. If you want to share your ideas, please feel free to leave a comment. There will be links in the description to the patches we've built today, so you can download them and have a closer look if you wish. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe and hit the bell. And have a good one.